My name is David Calloway. I'm 43 years old, and I live in a small city in Ohio called Maplewood, or at least I used to live there. I was a civil engineer for 18 years. Quiet job, steady income. Not glamorous, but honest work that I was proud of. I was married for 11 years to a woman named Sandra, and for most of those 11 years, I believed I had a good life. I had a house, a family, a reputation in my community that I had built carefully, brick by brick, over nearly 2 decades. I want you to picture that for a moment, not the house itself, but what it represented to me. I had grown up with almost nothing. My father left when I was 7. My mother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry for most of my childhood. We moved 6 times before I turned 16. So when I finally bought that house, a 4-bedroom on Elmwood Drive with a proper garden and a driveway that was actually mine, I didn't take it for granted. Not for a single day. That house was not just property to me. It was proof. Proof that I had made it. Proof that the son of a woman who once cried over a broken washing machine because she couldn't afford to fix it had built something real and lasting. And on a Sunday afternoon in September, with my entire family watching, my mother-in-law Patricia stood in my living room, pointed at the front door, and told me to get out. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't asking. She was announcing. And every single person in that room, my wife, my brother-in-law, 2 cousins, and Patricia's sister Diane, they all watched. And not one of them said a word in my defense. Some of them nodded. One of them actually smiled. I want to tell you what happened next. Because what happened next is something none of them saw coming. Not Patricia, not Sandra, not a single person standing in that room. But before I get there, I need to take you back to where it all began. Because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I was before that Sunday, and who Patricia decided I was the moment I walked into her daughter's life. I met Sandra 11 years before that Sunday. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. She was warm, funny, and completely unpretentious. She laughed too loud at bad jokes. She ordered the pasta when everyone else was pretending to eat salad. I liked her immediately. We dated for 2 years. She met my mother. I met hers. And that was when I first felt it. That cold, polite, assessing look that Patricia gave me the night Sandra brought me to their family home for dinner. She shook my hand and smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. She asked about my job, my background, my plans, the way an interviewer asks questions they've already decided the answers to. Patricia came from what she liked to call old money. Her late husband had owned 3 furniture stores and left her the house, a comfortable inheritance, and an unshakable belief that her daughter deserved better than a civil engineer from a single-parent household. She never said that directly. Not at first. Instead, she said things like, "Sandra has always been used to a certain quality of life, David. I'm sure you understand." Or, "It's wonderful that you're ambitious. I just hope ambition is enough." Small sentences, carefully placed, like little stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples outward that you felt long after she had moved on to another topic. Sandra always brushed it off. "That's just how Mom is," she'd say. "She's protective. She'll warm up to you." She never did. When we got engaged, Patricia asked Sandra privately if she was certain. Sandra told me about it the next morning, almost as an afterthought while making coffee. She said her mother had asked whether she had considered all her options. I remember standing there with my coffee mug and deciding, consciously deciding, not to let it hurt me. I chose to be bigger than the insult. I chose to focus on Sandra, on our future, on the house we were already saving to buy together. That was my choice. And at the time, I believed it was the right one. What I didn't understand yet was that Patricia read my silence not as dignity. She read it as weakness. Sandra and I bought our home in the 2nd year of our marriage. The house on Elmwood Drive needed work. The kitchen was outdated. The back porch had soft boards that needed replacing. The garden was overgrown. I spent the better part of 3 years restoring it. Evenings, weekends, every spare hour I had. I tore out the old flooring myself. I rebuilt the back porch from scratch. I designed the garden layout, planted it, and maintained it every season. Sandra helped where she could, but her job in hospital administration was demanding, and I was happy to carry the weight. It was my project as much as our home, and I was good at it. My neighbors noticed. Colleagues who visited noticed. Even Sandra's friends commented on what we had built together. But Patricia? Patricia visited once a month for Sunday dinners, and not once in 11 years did she say anything more than, "It's coming along." That was it. That was her full acknowledgement of everything I had poured into that house. It's coming along. Like I was a renovation project that hadn't quite finished. Like I was a work in progress she was still evaluating. And through all of it, I stayed quiet. I cooked the dinners. I offered the good wine. I sat at my own table and listened to Patricia talk about her late husband's properties and her sister's husband's business and all the things that, in her opinion, represented real success. I stayed quiet because I loved Sandra. I stayed quiet because I believed that loyalty and patience and doing the right thing would eventually be recognized. I was wrong. The cracks in my marriage started so gradually that I almost didn't see them. I don't know exactly when Sandra started changing. Looking back now, I think it was gradual, the way a tide goes out. You don't notice it happening. You just look up one day and realize the water is gone. She started working later. Not occasionally, consistently. Every week, more evenings away, more dinners with colleagues, more weekends where she was present in the house but somewhere else entirely in her mind. I asked, once, whether everything was all right between us. She said she was stressed at work and needed space to breathe. I gave her space. I later learned that the space I gave her was filled by someone else. A man she worked with, a hospital administrator named Gregory, who came from what Patricia apparently considered the right kind of background. I didn't know that then. What I noticed was Patricia's visits becoming more frequent, and her manner toward me shifting, from cold politeness to something quieter and more deliberate. She started arriving unannounced. She started staying longer. She started having private conversations with Sandra in rooms where I was quietly asked to give them a moment. In my own house. I sat in my garden on those evenings, the garden I had designed and planted and tended for 9 years, and I listened to the low murmur of voices inside and told myself I was imagining things. I was not imagining things. The Sunday it happened, Patricia arrived at noon. She had called Sandra the night before. I heard the tail end of the call, something about making sure everyone is there, and by the time I came downstairs that morning, Sandra had already called her brother Marcus and 2 cousins I hadn't seen in over a year. I noticed it but said nothing. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and read the newspaper like it was a normal Sunday. By 1 o'clock, the living room was full. Patricia sat in the armchair closest to the fireplace, my armchair, the one I had reupholstered myself 2 winters ago. Marcus sat on the sofa with his arms crossed. The cousins stood near the window. Sandra stood beside her mother, not looking at me. Patricia waited until everyone had settled. Then she looked at me and said very calmly, "David, this isn't working. We all know it. Sandra deserves better, and this house deserves better. It's time for you to go." I looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at the floor. I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the wall. I looked at the cousins. One of them, I still don't know which one, smiled. A small, satisfied smile, like someone watching the final scene of a film they had already seen. Patricia stood up from my armchair, smoothed her skirt, and said, "Your things can be packed by this evening. I think it's best if you make this simple, David. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. I had built that house. I had restored every room in it. I had planted every tree in that garden. And I was standing in my own living room being told to leave by a woman who had never once offered to help, never once acknowledged what I had sacrificed, never once treated me as anything more than an inconvenience in her daughter's life. And the people who were supposed to know me, supposed to be my family by marriage, by 11 years of shared meals and holidays and ordinary Sundays, not one of them said a word. Not one of them said, "Wait." Not one of them said, "Is this right?" They just watched. Some of them nodded. One of them smiled. And I stood there, very still, and I said nothing. Because I had already made a phone call that morning, while the coffee was brewing, while Patricia was still on her way over. I had made a very quiet, very important phone call, and the person I had called was already on their way. I want to be very clear about something. I did not plan this as revenge. I planned it as protection. 3 weeks before that Sunday, Sandra had told me she wanted a divorce. She had been calm about it, almost clinical, the way you discuss a business decision rather than the end of a marriage. She said she had spoken to a lawyer. She said she felt the house should go to her since her name was on the mortgage. She said she thought it would be cleaner if I simply found somewhere else to stay while the paperwork was sorted. I listened to all of it. Then I went to my study, closed the door, and called my own lawyer. A man named Robert Hale, who I had known for 12 years, and who had handled the original property paperwork when Sandra and I first bought the house. And Robert reminded me of something that Sandra and Patricia, and apparently Sandra's lawyer, had all overlooked. The mortgage was in both our names. But the deed, the actual property deed, registered at the county office, amended quietly and legally 4 years into our marriage when Sandra had asked me to refinance in my name alone to protect her credit rating during a difficult financial period at her job. The deed was in my name. Only my name. I was the sole legal owner of the house on Elmwood Drive. Sandra had signed the refinancing paperwork herself. Robert had the original documents. And on that Sunday morning, while Patricia was preparing her announcement and Sandra was calling the family together, Robert Hale was driving across Maplewood with a copy of the deed and a letter prepared on official legal letterhead. He arrived at 2:17 in the afternoon. I heard the doorbell. Patricia frowned. Sandra looked confused. I walked to the front door and opened it myself. Robert stood on the step in his good coat, briefcase in hand, and I said, "Come in, Robert. Thank you for coming." The living room went very quiet. Robert did not sit down. He opened his briefcase, removed 2 documents, and placed them on the coffee table, the same coffee table I had sanded and refinished by hand 6 years ago. He said, in the calm, measured voice of a man who has delivered difficult news many times before, "Mrs. Calloway," he looked at Patricia, "I represent Mr. David Calloway in this matter. I want to make the legal position clear before any further arrangements are discussed." He then read, slowly and clearly, the relevant sections of the property deed. He stated my name. He stated the registration number. He stated the date of transfer. He stated, without any ambiguity whatsoever, that the house on Elmwood Drive was the sole legal property of David James Calloway, and that no other party held ownership rights, tenancy rights, or the legal authority to require Mr. Calloway to vacate the premises. The room was silent for a very long time. Patricia was the first to speak. She said, "That can't be right." Robert said politely, "I assure you it is." She looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at her hands. Marcus uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. One of the cousins, the one who had smiled, was no longer smiling. I looked at Patricia. I looked at Sandra. And I said very quietly, "I think it's time for everyone to go home." They left within 20 minutes. Patricia last of all, moving slowly, not speaking, not looking at me. The armchair she had been sitting in, my armchair, sat empty in the middle of the room. I sat down in it after they had gone. I sat there for a long time, in the house I had built, in the room I had restored, looking out at the garden I had planted. And I thought about the 11 years I had spent trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I didn't belong. I thought about my mother, working double shifts in a hospital laundry so that her son could have a future worth having. I thought about every Sunday dinner I had cooked, every glass of wine I had poured, every insult I had absorbed quietly and chosen not to answer. And I understood something in that moment that I had perhaps always known but never fully accepted. You cannot earn dignity from people who have decided not to give it. You can only build it yourself, quietly, carefully, in the spaces they ignore, until the day comes when the truth is simply too large and too documented for anyone to dismiss. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. The house remained mine. Sandra moved into an apartment closer to the hospital. Patricia never contacted me again. Gregory, the man Sandra had been seeing, I heard later that things between them didn't last. But that part of the story was no longer my concern. What I kept was simpler and more valuable than anything else I could have walked away with. I kept the house on Elmwood Drive. I kept the garden I had built with my own hands. and I kept the knowledge, quiet, certain, unshakable, that I had never needed their approval. I had only ever needed the deed. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is something my mother told me once, standing in the kitchen of our third rented apartment, after another long shift, still in her uniform. She said, "David, the people who underestimate you quietly are doing you a favor. They leave you alone long enough to build something real." She was right. They left me alone, and I built something real. And when the moment came, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I didn't explain myself to people who had already made up their minds. I just opened the front door for my lawyer and let the deed speak for itself.